A person's personality is probably the only thing about them that is completely and utterly unquantifiable. Even when compared to other people, everyone's unique persona is not just idiosyncratic, but so complicated that it often becomes a point of contention what parts are even included in the definition of the word personality. Today, I plan to explore with you the many ways humans have tried to understand, explain, describe, and yes, even quantify the thing that we call a personality. The oldest example I could find of a system for categorizing people into different personality types is the four temperaments theory. I'm not really sure who originally came up with it, but the oldest man who talked about it was Hippocrates, a physician in ancient Greece. Yes, I've found another excuse to talk about ancient Greece. If you're tired of me talking about ancient Greece, sign this petition to revoke my internet access. Hippocrates described the four temperaments as choleric, sanguine, melancholic, and phlegmatic. And if anything about this seems a little familiar, it might be because this method of personality categorization was heavily influenced by the four humors, the thing where old-timey doctors thought there were only four fluids in the body and they caused any and all illnesses, physical or mental. Anyway, these four temperaments, much like the four humors, were basically a combination of the presence or lack of two different traits, extroversion and neuroticism. So, for example, a melancholic person is someone who is neurotic and introverted, meaning they aren't very social or assertive, whereas a sanguine person is someone who is mentally stable, meaning they don't often feel negative emotions, and they are extroverted, meaning they are actively social and charismatic. Also, it was believed that these personalities were caused by imbalances in the four humors, like a person who is choleric has too much blood, and a person who is sanguine has too much yellow bile. Another thing to note about these is that they were all assigned one of the four elements, which matched the humor they were characterized by having an excess of. A choleric person has too much blood, but this also means their element would be air. A phlegmatic person has too much phlegm, and their element is water. A melancholic person has too much black bile, and their element is earth. And finally, a sanguine person has too much yellow bile, and their element is fire. This might explain why your well-adjusted and introverted friends are always covered in water, and why your emotionally unstable extroverted friends are always on fire. Of course, there are lots and lots of examples, even contemporary ones, of people assigning personalities to natural elements, the most popular of which probably being horoscopes. And that is the only time I will be mentioning astrology in this video in order to drive home how irrelevant it is to the topic. A common theme throughout these examples is that they liken people and their characteristics and idiosyncrasies to complex natural systems that manifest in myriads of ways and can be combined with each other in even more ways. It's fascinating to think that classical era humans had such an understanding of the depth of human variability, despite the fact that there were only, like, what, a million of them at the time or something? But what about now? Surely contemporary psychology and behavioral analysis has brought us a more satisfactory answer to the question, what makes people the way they are? Well, I don't know, if only there was some kind of... These four temperaments and four humors are widely regarded as outdated and wrong, because there are people who are anemic and not angry all the time. But the ancient Greeks couldn't have been expected to know that, so it's fine. What we're really interested in here, though, is how this influenced modern personality typing. Probably the main takeaway that future psychologists had from the four temperaments was that personalities were a fluid thing that, though clearly defined, could change based on a person's current situation. The only difference is that back then, they thought too much black bile made you sad, and now we think that things like divorce and losing your job make you sad. It's also now estimated that anywhere from 30 to 50% of your personality is determined by your genetics, meaning the rest is entirely a product of your experiences and your environment. This idea has permeated our understanding of personalities so much by now that the dictionary definition of the word personality includes that it's a combination of innate traits as well as developed characteristics and qualities that form an individual's distinct personality. I probably could have written that better. Culture is something that heavily influences a person's personality. It's funny actually, it doesn't just influence their starting personality, but it also influences the ideal persona that they strive for, what character traits are considered desirable, and which should be punished or avoided at all costs. It makes people decide to hide or suppress aspects of who they are to better fit with their culture, sure, but It also unifies people among a certain culture and allows for better communication and understanding between people. As an example, Americans value things like confidence and individualism. Go figure. So a lot of people that we look up to or strive to be more like, entrepreneurs, actors, athletes, emulate these ideals. This is opposed to somewhere like Russia, where their value of intellect causes them to idolize chess players, or how French people value aesthetics and beauty, and that leads them to idolizing fashion designers and models. Or Japan, where, I'm not going to pretend like I understand any of this, but I'm sure what I said still applies, somehow. Anyway, different cultures make different personalities, and different personalities make different cultures. It's a big, never-ending cycle that never lands in the same spot twice. This even extends to things like political ideologies and religious views, but I wouldn't dare speak another word of that lest I risk making half the people watching click off this video. So, genetics, experience, and culture are all very important in determining a person's personality, and it naturally follows that if a person's environment changes, or the culture around them changes, their personality will too, to a varying degree. But doesn't this all still feel a little nebulous? Like, sure, I can look at someone and say, well, their parents were both very happy people, and they live in a place that values environmentalism, and they were bullied as a child. Therefore, they will be happy, environmentally conscious, and emotionally defensive. But that describes, like, millions of people. It's so broad and non-specific. What if I want to know what kind of sandwich I am? I'm sure you've all taken, or at the very least heard of, these wacky, goofy personality tests online. What Disney princess are you? What was your job in a past life? If you were a sailboat, what would the mast look like? Why did your wife leave you? These tests are all weird offspring of the more psychologically informed personality tests developed by people who know what they're doing. I'm of course talking about things like the MBTI, the Enneagram, the Hexaco, you name it. What most of these do is take a handful of traits and measure how strongly you express those traits on some sort of sliding scale. One that nearly all personality tests have in common is extroversion and introversion. Yes, the 4 temperaments did technically get something right. But these two words have taken on a certain connotation, and in our modern American culture have morphed into words that mean lonely or party animal. In the context of determining someone's personality, though, they really just mean how sociable you are, or how much mental effort you put into thinking about others versus thinking about yourself. The main things a personality test wants to measure are your behaviors, preferences, motivations, emotional responses, and interpersonal interactions. That's not to say your personality is determined by these things, they're just the easiest things to analyze in order to identify someone's personality. I mean, imagine if you went into a job interview and instead of handing you the Big Five or Hexaco, the first thing they asked was, how is your relationship with your mother? Anyway, these metrics allow the tester to develop an understanding of your characteristics and patterns, but that's not all. A lot of them, most notably the Enneagram, put a huge focus on growth and personal development over time, allowing the test taker to gain an understanding of themselves for the purpose of improving their life. Separating people into dichotomies has its uses, allowing us to understand how others' way of handling conflict or looking at situations differs from our own, and calling people either more agreeable or disagreeable allows us all to understand one another more quickly. But there's one thing these tests excel at. By far, the most common purpose of these tests is to determine a person's compatibility with a certain job or position, which means the results are usually meant to get someone else to understand your personality so they can do something with that information. Some other common purposes include match compatibility, mental illness diagnostics, and even forensics, but these often look quite different, understandably so. The MBTI, or Myers-Briggs test, is probably one of the most currently well-known personality tests. It evaluates individuals according to 4, or 5 if you're actually keeping score I guess, metrics. Introversion versus extroversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and judging versus prospecting. Its purpose is often stated to be a combination of all the ones I've talked about. It helps you find a good job for yourself, it helps you understand romantic relationships, it encourages introspection and reflection instead of just passing off your info to your employer. It's like the full package. But you know, I think there's a way to incorporate several personality test strengths while avoiding their weaknesses to create something truly eye-opening. If only there was someone willing to do something like that. Ladies and gentlemen and everybody else. Before I start things off here, I want to clarify that this is entirely a passion project of mine, and I am not college educated or even all that informed. I just did a bit of independent research and felt like taking a stab at this whole personality test business. After researching all these tests and how they work, I decided the MBTI had the best underlying structure for my specific purpose. It has 4 spectrums which, as I mentioned before, express themselves on either side of a sliding scale. This creates 16 possible combinations of these 4 traits, and that's what I ended up with. That's about all I pulled from the MBTI though, because the spectrums themselves were built to better encapsulate the Enneagram's focus on interpersonal interaction and motivations for growth. What I started with was the one thing that virtually every personality categorization system had in common: extroversion and introversion. I decided to split it up into 2 things, however, in order to better express the different ways these traits can manifest in a person. I came up with the emotional range and confidence metrics. Emotional range is split up into expressive and stoic, expressive being wildly varied in emotion, and stoic being less likely to express outward emotion. This of course doesn't mean stoic people are incapable of emoting, it just means that they don't lend themselves to their feelings as much as expressive people. Confidence was a metric I made to represent extroversion and introversion, but it's also partially influenced by the hexaco's agreeableness trait. It's split up into the assertive and passive traits, which highlight a person's likelihood to take charge in a social situation or voice their opinions even when it might lead to conflict. This means it's not always a good thing to be assertive, but of course it's not always a good thing to be passive. What's interesting about this specific metric is that once people started taking the test I made, it became obvious that there were way more people that fell under the passive category. I'm gonna be totally transparent with you here, I have no idea why this might be, but if I had to guess, it might be that my questions might have unintentionally made assertiveness seem like aggression. Of course, it's also possible that there naturally are more people that make an effort to fit in and not rock the boat and all that. I mean, there's a reason we organize into a society with leaders and followers most of the time. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Next up is self-discipline. I took more than a little inspiration for this category from Dungeons & Dragons and its 9 alignments. Or more specifically, this D&D alignment test by EasyDamas that I've talked about before in a previous video. The labels here are lawful and chaotic, which distinguish people more concerned with moral consistency and respect for authority with people who are guided more by their whims and emotions. Both of these are socially acceptable ways of living, even if the word chaotic might sound negatively connotated. It might seem a little narrow-minded to categorize people this way, and you're right. Mentality is the final metric I used for this test, which pretty much describes the way you solve problems and how you perceive the world. Think of it as the last 3 letters of the MBTI rolled into one. Again, I am not at all qualified to be doing or saying any of this, but I just think it's fun, and at least a handful of people like my test, so, get off my back or whatever. Mentality is split into rational and imaginative. Rational being the more math and science oriented, organized, and efficient individual, imaginative being more art and culture oriented, mentally flexible and unpredictable. I like to imagine it as 2 sides of the same coin, really, and it's not like if you take the test and get rational, that means you can't appreciate art, or if you get imaginative, you're automatically messy and dumb. It's just where your focus in life lies. So that's about it for how I went about my categories. As for the test itself, I just used quotev to make 48 true or false statements that each correspond to one of the 4 spectrums I just laid out. I think my main aim with these 4 categories was to describe at least 4 facets of a person that were different enough from each other to spark a discussion between 2 people who got results only 1 letter apart. Like, if you take the test and get SPCI, you can acknowledge that someone else with a result of EPCI has a lot in common with you, but there is a lot of discussion to be had about that one difference. Anyway, I also added elements to all the results, just for flavor really, and as an homage to the 4 temperaments. I would greatly appreciate if you took the test. I left a link to it in the description. I'm still looking for more data on it to analyze it before I make the second draft, though. Alright, so what did we actually learn today? Well, personality, like I said before, is very fluid, and a number of factors determine what personality you're predisposed to at birth, let alone what kind of personality you develop over the course of your life. Efforts to identify and describe and categorize personality types are neat, and they're certainly not random or baseless, but I do think it's important to remember that these categories are something we impose onto our concept of a personality. We divide personalities in a way we see as useful or meaningful, and that's all these tests are. It's all made up and arbitrary, and your sense of self and sense of identity are yours and yours alone, no matter what a quiz or test tells you. Oh my god. Self-reflection is something that you decide to do for yourself, and an MBTI test or an Enneagram or a Hexaco can be something that helps you solidify yourself and reinforce your ego or self-concept. Take it from me, if I can spend a few hours googling stuff and then make a 48-question test that some people actually say describes them, then anyone probably can. And that means that all this stuff is arbitrary, and ultimately it serves as a reminder that each and every person is unique, and yada yada yada, thanks for watching, be yourself, blah blah blah. Whew. Alright, so I'm a little worried. My most popular video on this channel is the Australia one, and I'm worried that people might have expected me to say funny stuff like in that one, but I made a different one. I may or may not be making more of those. I guess it all depends on what kind of feedback I get. I don't know. I'll probably just end up making whatever I want, and you can't stop me. Let me know what you thought of this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.